Shameless plug in case you missed it, I just uploaded a 2.5-hour video about Drexia. When you're done with this video, make sure to check that out if you haven't yet, since I put an absolute ton of work into making it. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, as a Patreon request from Waffles, I'm talking about the 1982 album from Philip Glass, Glassworks. Well, today it seems I've been given something a little off format, but one that I was more than willing to work with. Let's talk about some modern classical music. This is a genre I'm off and on whether I think it makes sense for me to cover. It's very much like on a case-by-case basis. I tend to be quite happy to talk about artists I already know for other electronic work dipping their toes into or taking direct influence from the genre, like Rum Pistol or Clark or anyone on the Erased Tapes label like Rival Councils or Ben Lucas Boyson or whoever. Though actual modern classical composers tend to be less on the table, as I have zero classical training or any background in that genre save for little bits and pieces I was taught in school and stuff. Thereby I have much less of an inroad to know what I'm actually talking about. Also, I've noticed that more in-depth fans of classical music can occasionally get touchy when people who don't have an active background in that genre try to talk about it. What, you don't know how to analyze the finer details of voice leading? Your opinion is automatically invalid. I don't know. Obviously no shade on people to whom classical music is their craft and really care about those kinds of details. I'm just probably not the right person to ask if you want someone to discuss it from that particular angle. However, there is one very specific subset of modern classical music that I think comes closer to giving me an inroad to talking about it and including in my format, and that's minimalism. Minimalist music was like a loose movement that got its start around the early 60s and a bit in the late 50s, coming from composers and artists like Lamonte Young, Steve Reich, or Terry Riley, among plenty of others. These artists often worked with very simplistic looping compositions that just repeat musical phrases over and over and maybe subtly iterate on them somewhat. Said composers did draw some criticism from certain subsets of the classical music community for feeling too shallow or even sometimes pop-influenced in comparison to the more studied works of, I don't know, 20th century serialist music or that kind of thing. But I think the minimalist music did actively help form some of the foundations for the traditions of electronic and ambient music we know today. Like how those genres usually base themselves around repetitive structures of beats and loops and whatnot. Back when I made a list of my top 100 favorite electronic albums of all time in 2016, I included a Steve Reich album called Music for 18 Musicians. Not because it features any synths, it doesn't, but because I saw it as directly influential to the formation of the genres I do have the most background in. Also because it's excellent and you should listen to it, and I am far from the only person to include a work like that, or that work in particular, on such a list. And if you want stuff with actual synthesizers, Terry Riley was one of the earlier adopters of that. He put out an electronic album in 1969 called A Rainbow in Curved Air, which could fit just as well next to any of the synth pioneers that would follow in the 70s, like Tangerine Dream and Klaus Schulze and all those guys. And some of these artists interacted more directly with the actual modern electronic music scene, which brings us to Philip Glass. Philip Glass is another one of the most important founding composers of the minimalist scene, and sometimes discussed as one of the more important composers of the 20th century, in the same breath as Steve Reich and Terry Riley and all those. He's still technically active today. Just last year, he had a guest appearance working with Jay Lin on her last album. He also once composed a chamber music ensemble version of the Aphex Twin track Ictedral, which got included on that guy's Donkey Rhubarb EP in 1995. So this guy's connection to the genre I care the most about is pretty well established. Though I'll freely admit he's an artist that I'd kind of more, loosely been meaning to look into more than I actually have previous background with. When I first got into Steve Reich and Terry Riley, I think back in my late high school or early college days, I also downloaded one album from this guy called Music in 12 Parts, specifically the 1996 recording from None Such Records. I found that one on someone else's greatest electronic albums of all time, and I just never got around to actually listening to it until I started work on this video. I think back in the day, it was after I had heard Terry Riley's 1968 recording of In C, and I found that to not be as fun of a listen as I hoped. So I saw the promise of a 3.5-hour minimalist work and thinking, maybe later. And then I would put it on the back burner for over a decade. Thanks, ADHD. That album, for the record, is really cool. It may be over 3 hours of what sounds like simple repeating arpeggios, but there's a constant sense of progression over the full work, with each repetition of a phrase slightly varying on the one that came before, and it's more investing a listen than it sounds like it would be on paper. Just not recommended to go through the whole thing all in one sitting. I have not heard any of his other works beside that one and the one I'm reviewing here. Make sure to recommend me other works of his you think are essential listening. I've heard good things about Einstein on the Beach. Pitchfork gave that a 10 out of 10, though that's also an opera, and I've never really cared much for opera, so I'm not sure if it'll be my thing, but yeah, I don't know. Have not heard that to confirm in any case. But I'm not here to talk about music in 12 parts, Einstein on the Beach, or any of his other stuff. I'm here to talk about Glassworks, a regular old traditional album he put out in 1982 after he'd moved on from the standard minimalist frameworks he helped pioneer, specifically as an attempt to introduce his work to a more mainstream audience and present in a much more easily accessible package. 6 tracks, all running on about 6 to 7 minutes each, adding up to a nice and compact 39 minutes. Much less of a commitment than the multi-hour experiences he tends to be known for. I have seen many people mark this as the best starting point to get into Philip Glass's work, and while I obviously can't fully confirm that myself, having only heard 2 works of his total currently, with this as my starting point, I can confirm that this is a very pretty collection of modern classical music. And it's electronic enough to more unambiguously fall in my format too. 2 of the 6 tracks here very prominently feature synthesizers in a way that is not just loose window dressing, they're built into the foundations of those pieces, so that's cool too. Granted, this is not an album that actually gives me very much to say or break down. There's not exactly an absolute ton going on over the course of these 6 tracks. Whether you're able to get into this will just depend on how immediately the mood is set for you and how much it ends up emotionally resonating. It's probably not the kind of thing that, unlocks new layers with more repeat listens. I probably listened to this thing 8 or 9 times while trying to get over writer's block with it, and it hit me in exactly the same way every time, regardless of how closely I was paying attention to it. I think Music in 12 Parts honestly did a slightly better job of maintaining my attention than this did. Heck, even though there's 6 tracks here, in spirit it's almost more like 3 tracks, each with a sort of mirrored and loosely reprised alternate version. So yeah, I'm not gonna tell you that I found the experience of this record to be mind-blowing or anything, or that it's going to become a new all-time favorite of mine, but I did still enjoy it a lot in spite of all that. Like I said, all of these compositions are very pretty and hit on the emotions and moods they're going for quite precisely. I do get why this would resonate on a deep enough level for other people to consider it to be an all-timer, especially if you do have more of a background in actual modern classical music than I do. The opening track, Opening, is an exceptionally emotive solo piano piece that just focuses on fluttering and shifting chords, but create a very warm and introspective melancholic mood. And of course it's directly mirrored by the closing track, Closing, which I'm fairly certain is just the exact same piece as Opening, but with more orchestral accompaniment, adding in string sections and light woodwinds. Hits on the same mood, about equally as effectively. The other 2 pairs of tracks in between aren't quite as exact matches for each other as Opening and Closing. They do clearly have distinct enough melodies to be able to tell apart from each other, but it's still clearly 2 pairs of tracks that are going for the same effects and meant to directly mirror each other. Floe and Rubric are the above-mentioned tracks that bring in the synthesizers, and they're much more propulsive and energetic than anything else on the album, just super frantic and fast-paced arpeggios, played with chiming synth melodies, round synth bass, and horns and flutes to go alongside all of them. Floe is a bit more major key and optimistic in its melodic tone, with parts that build up and down more, like this one quick moment where the whole mix falls away for I think a solo French horn bit, and then building back up to its previous density again. While Rubric gets a bit more minor key and I suppose more determined sounding in its melodies. Doesn't change as much in terms of its dynamics, but the arpeggios do switch between half-time and double-time quite a bit. Also, some of those horn accompaniments that go alongside the synths get pretty dang epic. That was probably the track on here that grew on me the most with repeat listens. The remaining pair of tracks is Islands and Facades. Two much quieter, more stripped-back, purely orchestral pieces, I think in 6/8, that hit on a fairly sad and lonely minor key kind of mood, and have very similar sounding melodies that almost feel like they could sound natural if you were to layer them directly on top of each other. I don't know if that would work, because I think they might be slightly different tempos, but it's very close. Islands is technically the more dynamic of the two pieces. The backing arpeggios step up and down between 4 different notes, with some lonely sounding clarinets playing like sustained notes on top. Also, the track gets a fair bit instrumentally denser and more dramatic in its second half. It doesn't get like faster, but it like just kind of gets louder and adds on more layers, I guess. So that's pretty cool. Although I think I ended up gravitating a bit more towards Facades. The instrumental mix of this piece may not progress as much, and the backing arpeggios tend to step up and down between 2 notes, so this piece is a lot more uniform, but the overall mix maintains a consistent sense of warmth that carried a bit more emotional depth for me on a personal level. I think this piece was originally written as like a soundtrack cue, and I think that does kind of show in a good way. But yeah, that's about everything to discuss in Glassworks. I don't know if I'd say I absolutely love this album, probably listened to it a few too many times in preparation for this review than was necessary, but I still liked it a lot, and I have no trouble imagining how other people would love this. It was definitely at least on the border of crossing over into gray territory for me in some listens, and obviously you can take me with a grain of salt on all that because I, again, no classical background. It's very simple, straightforward, and to the point as far as these kind of modern classical arrangements go, but it's also very easy to wrap your head around and get yourself immersed in its emotionality. A solid demonstration of where Philip Glass got the notoriety in this space that he has, and yeah, that's about all I have to say. This was very nice. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on this. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.